Hello Year 11, Mr Godman here and welcome to this Year 11 exam feedback tutorial. In this video I'm going to show you how to improve your exam result by up to 3 grades. First of all, get ready to use this video properly. You're going to need a copy of your exam paper, a pen and paper, and you're going to need to put any distractions like mobile phone away, and you will also need a copy of your revision guides or your medicine workbooks. Pause the video now, find those things, and when you're ready, hit play. First of all, let's look at how you did on question 1. This was the knowledge recall question. I'm going to ask you to correct your answers now using the correct answers which you can see in front of you. Notice the 2 areas shaded here were the ones where there were most misunderstandings among students. Quite a few of us didn't know when the Royal Society was established or when Thomas Sydenham did his work. When you've corrected your work, hit play. And here are the other knowledge recall questions. Notice the ones shaded in are the ones which a lot of people missed or got wrong. We needed to know our public health laws better. We had some problems with our British sector of the Western Fronts questions, and a lot of us didn't know specific things which Nightingale did in British hospitals. Most of us wrote about what she did in the Crimea, but we needed to know what changes she made to hospitals back in Britain. Pause the video, correct your answers, and when you're ready, hit play. Okay, let's look at question 2. This was a key features question worth 4 marks. To get full marks, you needed to identify 2 key features of the underground hospital at Arras. You also needed to add an additional detail for each of those features. So, here's what a perfect answer looks like. Firstly, the hospital had good facilities. Now I can add a little detail to that by saying that it had 700 beds, lighting and running water. And my second feature was that staff performed surgery at this hospital. And I've added a little extra detail that it had an operating theatre staffed by RAMC surgeons. And this earns me my 4 marks. Quite a few of us dropped marks here. The common mistakes were, many of us wrote more than 4 sentences, so we were writing too much. Secondly, some of us fell into the trap of writing a detail which didn't really relate to the feature. Let me show you what I mean. Here's an example of a student that's done that mistake. The student identifies a feature, the hospital had 700 beds, but then the detail doesn't really relate to that. It was also close to the front, which doesn't really have anything to do with the beds at all. Now I want you to pause the video and correct your answers. When you're ready, hit play. Okay, now let's look at the source evaluation question. To get the most out of this video, you need to pause the video now and have a really good reread of the sources, reread the question, and then reread your own answer. Until you've done this, you're not ready for the next stage. So pause the video now, and when you've done it, hit play. Okay, so question 3 was the source evaluation question worth 8 marks. We were asked to study both of the sources and then we had to answer the following question. How useful are these sources for an inquiry into the problem of trench foot? Now you can see I've already highlighted the focus of the inquiry, the problem of trench foot, and you should do the same on your paper. We have to make sure that everything we write is related back to that focus. We're given some instructions too. We need to explain our answer, and we need to use both of the sources plus our own knowledge of the historical context. So to get full marks, this is what we needed to do. We needed to analyse and evaluate both sources. So what does that mean? Well, it means the following. Firstly, we needed to analyse and evaluate the content. That means we needed to make some supported inferences, and we needed to support them with our own knowledge. We also needed to evaluate the provenance. Now the provenance means the background of the source. We refer to this as the nature, that means the type of source, the origin, that means who made it, when and where, and the purpose of the source, why it was made. Now we needed to identify some of the features of the provenance and comment on how they affected the usefulness of the source, trying to say how they make the source more or less useful for our inquiry. We also needed to reach a judgment about both sources. How useful are they? Now, in order to do this, we need to know how to judge how useful sources are. So let's remind ourselves. When we're judging how useful sources are, the first thing we look at is the content of the source. Now there are two things to think about here. Firstly, is the content of the source relevant to the inquiry? Does it actually have information which is useful for the inquiry we're following? Secondly, we might think about this. Is the content of the source accurate? This means true. We can work out whether it's accurate by backing it up with our own knowledge. The second thing we might look at is the provenance of the source. Firstly, we might ask ourselves about the nature, origin and purpose of the source. What type of source is it? Who made it and when? And why was it made? Now when we've thought about that, we can ask ourselves, does this make the content of the source more or less useful for our inquiry? Secondly, we might think about the typicality of the source. This means, does the source show how things were everywhere all the time? On the other hand, is the source quite unusual and it doesn't really show us an accurate picture of how things were everywhere? Now quite a lot of us dropped marks on this question, so let's look at the most common mistakes. Firstly, a lot of us forgot to address the question at all. We were asked how useful, so we should address that in our big points and keep coming back to that throughout our answer. Some of us ignored the sources altogether and we just wrote about our own knowledge. Another common mistake was that we quoted the sources, but we didn't really use those quotes to make inferences of our own. Some of us didn't comment on how relevant the sources were, how accurate they were, how reliable they were, or how typical they were, so we weren't really judging the usefulness of them. Some of us wrote about provenance before we wrote about the content. Now, although that's not always wrong, it does make your job a lot harder. So try to remember, always comment on the content before you start writing about the provenance. Some of us ignored the provenance altogether and didn't make any comments on that. And lastly, some of us made some really simple comments on provenance. For example, for source A, a lot of people wrote, he was there, so the source is reliable. Well, we're looking for something a little bit more developed than that, and I'll show you what I mean in a moment. Okay, let's have a quick look at source A and think about what you might have written. Firstly, let's think about what inferences or conclusions we can draw from this source about the problem of trench foot. This source suggests that the problem of trench foot was caused by the conditions in the trenches. And we know this because the source describes some of those problematic conditions. It also suggests that the problem of trench foot affected many soldiers, gives us some statistics on that. Lastly, it also suggests that the army took trench foot very seriously and they put in measures to try and prevent it. All of these are good inferences. We also need to comment on the provenance of the source. Well, for example, the person who made the source was a captain, and that means he had responsibility for a whole group of soldiers' health, so he would probably be a useful witness on the preventative measures put in place to keep soldiers healthy. Notice, I'm not just saying he was there, so he knows stuff. I'm saying he was a captain, and therefore he would have known about the preventative measures used for his unit of soldiers. Secondly, we don't actually know when or where this source is describing, so we can't really judge whether it was typical of the whole war or whether it was typical of all parts of the trench network, because we don't know exactly what period of the war and what place on the network he is describing. Now let's look at source B. Firstly, let's think about the inferences we could make. Well, the source suggests that the problem of trench foot was caused by conditions in the trenches, and we can see some of the conditions there. The muddy ground, for example, that perhaps was one of the reasons why soldiers' feet got so wet and damp all the time, which led to trench foot. It also suggests that the army developed very methodical ways of identifying trench foot quickly, so we can see this medical officer doing a foot inspection. And that also suggests that the army took trench foot seriously because they put in place measures to try and prevent it in this way. We also need to comment on the provenance. Here are some suggested ideas that you could have made. Firstly, this source, this photograph, was made in 1918. Now that's useful because it tells us that by the end of the war there were preventative steps in place to stop the problem of trench foot. However, on the other hand, this may not be typical of the whole war. Perhaps earlier in the war their measures weren't quite so good for dealing with the problem. Another point you can make is that this photograph could have been staged, and a lot of people did make that point, but they didn't really explain how or why. Think about this. The army and the government might want people back in Britain to see this sort of photograph, to show them that their soldiers' health was being cared for away on the front. Now let's look at how we put all that into a really high quality paragraph. Now remember, you're going to write one paragraph on each source. Here's the method. We make a big point, we analyse and evaluate the content, then we analyse and evaluate the provenance, and then we reach a judgment. Let's see how it works in practice. Here's my big point. As you can see, I'm addressing the question directly. Next, I take a quote from the source. I use my quote to make an inference or conclusion of my own about trench foot. Then I need to explain that and prove that the source is accurate using my own knowledge. So I've brought in some knowledge of my own to support what the source says. Notice the phrase that I use here. This is accurate because. You should use that phrase in your own work. Now I'm going to go back to the source and do exactly the same thing again. I'll make another supported inference. Here it comes. I've started by taking another quote from the source, and then I use that to make an inference or conclusion of my own. Now I'm going to say that this is relevant because remember, that's one of the other ways that we judge the usefulness of the source, whether it has relevant information in it. Now I think this is really relevant because it tells us how big the problem of trench foot really was. Now, I'm about to switch from evaluating and analysing the content to evaluating and analysing the provenance, and I want my reader to know this. So I've put a sentence halfway through my paragraph that says, the provenance also affects how useful the source is. This is like a little flag for the examiner to read, and it tells him that I am now switching from the content of the source to the provenance. I need to now pick an aspect of the provenance and say how it affects the source's usefulness. So as you can see, I've chosen to pick on the person who made the source. He was a captain. I'm going to say how that makes the source more useful for my inquiry. Here it is. I'm trying to explain that he was in a good position to tell us about the problems of trench foot because he was in charge of a whole unit of soldiers. Now I'm going to go back to the source and take another feature of provenance. In this case, I'm picking out the fact that we don't actually know when or where the source refers to. This time I'm going to explain a limitation. I'm going to say how this aspect of the provenance makes the source less useful for our inquiry. Here, I'm going to bring in a little bit more of my own knowledge to help me explain that. Remember, the question asked me to bring my own knowledge in, so I have to use it along the way. Now that I've done that, I'm going to reach an overall judgment about the source. In this case, I think it's fairly useful, and I've summarised my main reasons why, and this is my paragraph completed. Now you should pause the video and I want you to write a perfect paragraph evaluating source B. You may want to zip back for a moment to read my notes about source B if they help you. When you have written your perfect paragraph, hit play. Okay, let's dive in now and look at question 4. This was a similarity and difference question worth 4 marks. The first thing that I've done is highlight some key phrases in the question. The first thing I've picked out is the focus. This question wants me to focus on attempts to prevent the spread of infectious diseases. I've also highlighted the 2 time periods which I've been asked to compare, 1500 to 1700, so that's the Renaissance, and 1700 to 1900, which is the 18th and 19th centuries. I've also highlighted the word similar, because in this case the question wants me to say one thing that was similar about the 2 periods. Now to get full marks, I needed to write 3 sentences maximum. The first sentence will be my big point, which gives a similarity between the 2 periods. My second sentence will be a specific example from the first time period. And my third sentence will be a specific example from the second time period. The common mistakes here were that a lot of us wrote too much. We were writing big paragraphs, and that's way more than we need for 4 marks. A lot of us got the wrong time periods. Some of us thought that the Renaissance was 1700 to 1900, so this was a big issue and we need to revise that carefully. Lastly, some of us wandered off the focus, and instead of talking about preventing the spread of infectious diseases, we started talking about other ideas like understanding disease or treating disease. So here are some suggested answers. You could have said that both periods tried to drive away miasma or bad smells. During the plague they carried pomanders, and during cholera epidemics they burned barrels of tar to drive away the bad smells. Another similarity was that in both periods the government issued public health laws. For example, the London mayor banned gatherings during the plague, and in the 19th century the government passed the 1875 Public Health Act. Another answer you could have gone for was that in both periods they tried isolating people with infectious diseases. Plague victims were shut in their homes in the Renaissance, and in the 19th century Nightingale introduced isolation wards in hospitals. Now what I want you to notice is how very specific my examples there are. A lot of people didn't have those kinds of specific examples in their work. I want you to pause the video now and rewrite your answer. Remember, 3 sentences maximum. When you're done, hit play. Okay, it's time for us now to look at question 5. This was an explain question worth 12 marks, and it was all about how attitudes to surgery changed after 1800. To get full marks here, we needed 3 paragraphs and we needed to explain 3 reasons why. The structure PEE would be useful. Remember, that means big point, evidence, and some explanation or elaboration. The common mistakes in this particular question were these. Some of us didn't focus enough on the question. We were asked why attitudes changed, so we had to keep coming back to that. Some of us didn't have enough knowledge, and so we need to revise a little bit better, especially on high-tech surgery. There was a lack of explaining connectives in some people's work, like this meant that, as a result, consequently, this mattered because, and so forth. In this particular question, we were asked to cover 1800 to the present, but a lot of people's answers stopped in 1900. Now, we have to cover the whole time period, so we have to have something about 19th century medicine here and something about modern medicine too. And lastly, there was a really common error that some people wrote that anaesthetics decreased the death rate. Well, when they were first introduced, they actually made death rates worse. It wasn't until antiseptics were developed that death rates improved. Okay, so what could you have written about? Here are some causes that you could have explained. You could have written a paragraph about Simpson's work on chloroform, the first successful anaesthetic really. And that led to better anaesthetics, solved the problem of pain, and so people feared surgery less. You could have written about Lister's work on carbolic acid, which was a big milestone in the development of antiseptic surgery. That improved infection rates, and it also led to the development of aseptic surgery, where surgeons wore gloves and masks to protect their patients from infection. That made surgery seem safer, and so people became more willing to trust it. You could have written about high-tech surgery. Now, this was a gap in people's knowledge. By high-tech surgery, we mean things like keyhole surgery, microsurgery, and robotic surgery. These sorts of developments made surgical procedures less invasive. Surgeons didn't have to cut open the body to quite such an extent. That meant that patients had a quicker recovery time, and more complex surgery like organ transplant was possible. And that made people more willing to go under the surgeon's knife. Another reason that some people mentioned was the development of penicillin, one of the first antibiotics. Now, that is relevant, but you need to think about how that changed attitudes towards surgery. And the big point here is that if you give somebody antibiotics after surgery, that can prevent infections taking hold. So it makes surgery safer and makes people more confident about getting surgery done. Okay, let's look at a perfect paragraph. We're going to follow that structure: point, evidence, and elaboration. Let's start with a big point. Notice how I've used the wording of the question and I've introduced a reason: the development of high-tech surgery. Now I'm going to explain that. Firstly, I'm going to give a very specific example of high-tech surgery. Then I'm going to begin an explanation of how that changed attitudes. Can you see I've used an explaining connective there as a result? But I'm not done yet because I want to write a developed explanation. So I've used another explaining connective: this matters because. Then I've added to my explanation by using the phrase furthermore. And I've also followed it up with yet another explaining phrase, consequently. And lastly, I've completed my explanation with another explaining phrase, as a result. And I've really focused there closely on how it changed people's attitudes, because this is what the question asked for. Notice you make a developed explanation by stringing several of these explaining connectives together, such as a result, this matters because, consequently, and so forth. Now I want you to pause the video and rewrite one of your own paragraphs for this question. When you're done, hit play. Okay, last of all, let's look at question 6. This was a judgment question worth 16 marks, and I was really impressed by the structure which many people used for it, so there were lots of positive signs. Here's what we wanted. Firstly, I needed you to plan your answer, and I noticed that a lot of people did not do that. Secondly, you needed a short introduction, followed by 3 main paragraphs. Now, each one of your main paragraphs had to either support or challenge, or support and challenge the statement of opinion, and you needed a short conclusion at the end. The common mistakes here were as follows. Too many people didn't focus on the question. Now remember, you have to constantly agree or disagree with the statement throughout your answer. If you struggle with that, then try using this phrase: this supports or challenges the statement because. There was a lack of specific knowledge from some people, and some people used knowledge out of period. For example, writing about the Renaissance when they should have been writing about the medieval period. A few of us got the wrong focus. Now for option 1, the first question, our focus was medics, people who treated disease. Some people wasted too much time just writing paragraph after paragraph about treatments rather than the actual people who treated disease. For option 2, our focus was understanding the cause of disease. So some people wasted time talking about preventions and treatments when the question wasn't really directing you for that. Another common mistake was not covering the whole period. In the second question, we were asked to cover 1800 to the present, so that means we had to write a bit about 19th century medicine and we had to write a bit about modern medicine as well. Finally, there was a really common mistake. In the first question, some of us wrote about medieval hospitals. Now that might be relevant, but do remember, medieval hospitals, most of them gave no medical treatment. They were just places for rest and relaxation when people were old or tired. Okay, let's look at question 1. As you can see, I'm about to make a bit of a plan for this question. Let me show you the kind of thing that I'm going to put in it. As you can see, my plan has 2 sides. I'm going to come up with some points to support the statement and some points to challenge it. Now the first section that I'm going to write in my answer is about physicians, because that's what the question asked me about. In the statement of opinion it says the physician was the most important person. So I've got a positive about physicians. They had a lot of qualifications and training, and they used rational explanations for disease, and that made them an important healer. However, I've also got some points to challenge that. I know that physicians' training wasn't very practical, and they used a lot of Galen's work, which just was incorrect. They were also too expensive for most people, so most people couldn't afford to see them. And they only diagnosed disease. They really didn't give treatment or surgery. Most physicians were trained by the church, so they were banned from cutting the patient open. Now the second section of my work is going to be about apothecaries. Firstly, I know that apothecaries took a less rational approach than physicians, so maybe physicians were better and more important than apothecaries. On the other hand, apothecaries were cheaper, so I know that a lot more people went straight to them instead of seeing a physician at all. The final section of my answer is going to be about women. I know that women were less qualified and educated than medieval physicians, so maybe they weren't as important as treatment givers. But on the other hand, I know that women had a lot of expertise, and a lot of their herbal remedies did actually work, which they gave to their families. They also did some important jobs that physicians did not do, like acting as midwives. Now let's look at the other option. Here, you were considering whether the work of Pasteur was the most significant development in understanding the cause of illness. Again, my plan is going to have two sides, points to support the statement and points to challenge the statement. I'm going to write a paragraph about Pasteur's work because that was in the question. Firstly, I've got some positives for Pasteur's work. He developed the germ theory, and that was really important because it ended the old ideas of spontaneous generation and miasma theory. And on top of that, he also proved that Snow's ideas about cholera were right. On the other hand, there are some limitations to Pasteur's work. His germ theory was slow to be accepted in Britain, and some of the top British doctors like Bastian opposed it. He also, although he discovered or theorised that microbes were the cause of illness, he didn't know that actually microbes are not the only cause of illness. So he didn't totally complete the answer about how people get sick. Also, Pasteur didn't actually go on to identify any specific germs which cause disease. My second section is going to be about Robert Koch. As you can see, on one hand, I think Koch, his work was less important than Pasteur because he was dependent on Pasteur's germ theory. But on the other, I think his work was more important because he actually identified specific bacteria like tuberculosis, and he developed a method of identifying bacteria too, which helped other people to discover further bacteria later. Lastly, I'm going to write a paragraph about DNA, because actually, in the 20th century, new knowledge on DNA has allowed us to understand the causes of hereditary disease as well. Okay, let me show you how to write a perfect intro. Let's work on the first option, the one about physicians in the medieval period. Here you can see the 3 steps we're going to make. Firstly, we're going to address the question. Here it is. Notice we're going to quote the question back at the examiner. Now I make an overall decision. How far do I agree with that statement? Lastly, I tell the examiner which 3 topics I'm going to write about in my answer. Here I'm going to write about physicians, apothecaries and women. And this is a perfect intro. I want you to pause the video now and rewrite your introduction. When you're done, hit play. Finally, let's look at how to craft a perfect main paragraph. This time we'll work on the other question about Pasteur. You can see the method here. I'm going to have a big point. I'm going to have some evidence and explanation. Now I'm going to try and do some positive explanation of Pasteur's work, and I'm also going to do some negative explanation to show the limitations of his work. So I'm going to get a bit of a debate going in my paragraph, and at the end I'm going to reach a judgment. Let's see how it works. Here's my big point. Now I want you to notice my phrasing here. Some of us forgot to address the question. One really good way of doing that is to write one point which partly challenges the statement, and so forth. Now I'm going to give some evidence of Koch's work. I'm going to explain what he actually did. Next, I need to think about whether his work was more or less important than Pasteur's. I'm going to do the positive side first of all. So as you can see, my next step is to explain the importance of Koch's work. I'm trying to explain here why his work really mattered and why it might be more important than Pasteur's. I'm going to develop that a bit further now by giving another reason why Koch's work was really important. At this point, I now want to get a bit of a debate going in my paragraph, so I'm going to switch to the other side and look at some of the limitations of Koch's work too. So here I am pointing out a real limitation of Koch's work and perhaps showing that it was less important than Pasteur's. Now when I've done this, I need to make sure that I have a final judgment overall. I have to make a decision here. And as you can see, I've decided in the end that actually Pasteur's work was more important. Now I want you to pause the video and rewrite one of your main paragraphs for this question. This brings us to the end of the tutorial. Now, if you'd like to go a little further and get some more practice and preparation for your final GCSE exam on medicine, then here are some other questions that you could try. Perhaps you could pick one of the question types that you did less well on in the Year 11 mock and have a go at it. I'm sure that your history teachers will mark anything that you choose to hand in. Good luck, guys.